All right, folks, if you're seeing me live on the post here and hearing me talk with our panelists, it's partly because I'm just trying to make sure we are live. I actually don't see the feed going live. All right, I'm going to check it on my phone while we're here, folks. You always have, oh, okay, we're live. Okay, that's very good. Okay, all right. So to everybody who's joining in, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh, welcome to this special edition of a webinar, Sikh Reflections on Black Lives Matters movement. Before I get into introducing our panelists, very quick request for all of you, if you can let us know where you're joining in from in the Facebook live chat. We have a Sevadar who's actually going to be monitoring that chat throughout the whole conversation for the next 30 to 45 minutes. Let us know where you're joining from, city, state, region, country. If you have any comments, questions, please feel free to post them. And my hope is at the end of this conversation, if we have a few minutes of our panelists' time, I'll field some of those questions to our panelists. So why are we here today? My name is Vishwajit Singh. I am coming to you from New York City in the island of Manhattan, more specifically in Harlem. And as you all know, there's two pandemics happening right now globally. We know the COVID-19 one. We hear a lot about it. It's called a pandemic. And we're living through it. Most of us are stuck in our homes for most part. And there's a second pandemic, which is not framed as a pandemic for most part, but I know a few scholars and activists have called it a pandemic, and that's a pandemic of race and racism here in the United States, but also many other parts of the globe. So I'm gonna refer to that as a pandemic. And so for me, I feel as somebody who is living in New York City, a city that has been impacted the most by COVID-19 pandemic, at least to date, a city that has also seen its fair share of African-American men, Black men, women, girls, boys, having cops called on them, getting shot and killed for no good reason. And so that keeps happening a lot. It happened in New York City quite a bit. It's happened in many other cities. So to me, it's a pretty personal sort of thing that I'm always asking myself, what can I do? What can I do as an American? What can I do as a Sikh? What can I do as a New Yorker? And it seemed like we had a threshold with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis a few weeks ago. And this movement called Black Lives Matter, which we've had since 2013, 2014, has become, according to some of the latest sort of statistics by experts, the largest social movement ever in American history. So that's a pretty significant statement for this movement that I know many have classified in very negative terms. But this is a movement now that has some of the numbers that I'm seeing, 20 to 25 million people that have participated in this movement. So the question arises, okay, what can we do? How can we be part of this movement in a constructive way? How can we be part of the solution to confront race and racism? To get to that question, I personally feel we also have to ask ourselves, how are we part of the problem as well? Because I know it's easy for people to say, and I'm going to talk about myself, I'm not a racist. I have Black friends. I live in New York City. I do a lot of work on diversity, inclusion, and equity. I'm very sympathetic and empathetic towards issues of race and racism. I'm not the one who should be targeted by those who are saying, hey, we need to have justice for Black people and other communities as well. So I want to start by just very honestly saying this. Look, I grew up in two kinds of households, two cultures predominant in my upbringing, the American culture and Punjabi Desi South Asian culture. And among many things that I learned from these two cultures, one thing that I learned very early on is dark skin is not as good as white skin. And that manifested in many different ways. Where you live, who you become friends with, who you date, who you marry, which gurdwaras you go to. All of these things are impacted by these very implicit biases we pick up very early on. And I'm just owning on to mine to start this conversation, that I have learned to have biases towards Black people, African Americans, Africans, and within the Indian context towards Dalits. So having said that, my work focuses a lot on how do we start these difficult conversations around how am I part of the problem? And okay, let's talk about how can we now become part of the solution. So We are coming to you through the feed of an organization called United Sikhs. They do a lot of humanitarian work. They're doing a lot of work around COVID-19 around the globe. And their tagline is recognize the human race as one. Now, to those of you who come from the Sikh faith, who are familiar with the Sikh faith, that statement has certain resemblance to the basic ethos of the Sikh faith, which is, look, we treat everybody as equal. You see that divine light in everybody, and your goal is to treat everybody equally. It's an easy thing to say. It's a very hard thing to do. So I want to thank United Sikhs for offering me this platform to have these very honest and robust conversations with 3 of our panelists who I'm going to introduce in a couple of minutes. Before I go there, I just want to quickly say to all of you, welcome to this webinar, Sikh Reflections on Black Lives Matter Movement. I brought 3 panelists who are activists. They wear many different, the stars, hats, or whatever word you want to use. They have very complicated stories, and no bio that I can read for you is going to do justice to who they are. But I know all of them kind of through different venues. So I'm gonna quickly now introduce them, and then we'll get started. But I highly encourage all of you to share your comments, your thoughts, and if you have questions in the live feed. We have somebody who's monitoring it towards the end. I'm going to try and see if I can post some of those questions and comments you have to our esteemed panelists. So I'm going to start with Gurpreet first. Gurpreet, if you can wave so people know. Gurpreet is joining us from Texas. I know Gurpreet through social media. So we're actually coming to you through Facebook. I know her through Facebook. Gurpreet is somebody who, when I first saw her on Facebook, very outspoken, very vocal about her Sikhi, her love for Sikhi and the issues she faces with predominantly Punjabis, who are the predominant population of Sikhs around the globe. She's also somebody who has a project called Embracing Sikhism for folks coming into Sikhi or wanting to know more about Sikhi, but coming from non-Sikh traditions. Gurpreet comes from a non-Sikh tradition. And so I thought it would be great to have her on and talk about her challenges and her love for Sikhi as well. Harleen is somebody I've known about as well, outside of actually social media context. I have, Harleen's from Michigan, and I have been to Michigan for a few youth camps. I have stayed at Harleen's parents' house, who are very gracious hosts. So our paths have crossed. I know about Harleen a little bit. I didn't know until I started planning this webinar through a friend of mine. I found out Harleen actually is now coming to us from Southern California. She is getting her PhD in sociology. So that is a rare thing. I actually don't know any sociologists or anybody pursuing sociology from within the Sikh community. We certainly should have many more, but I think Harleen is a very rare sort of person who is pursuing sociology. And to me, I was like, okay, this is somebody I want to have on my panel. So Harleen focuses a lot of her work on anti-Blackness in the Sikh community, also on racialization in the American society, but with a Sikh lens. So I think she's going to be a really amazing guest to have here. So thank you, Harleen. I don't know if you waved your hand, but I think people can figure out after Gurpreet, I'm saying Harleen, so you're here. Third is a friend of mine, Arjun Singh Sethi, who is based out of Washington, D.C. Our paths have crossed over the years. Arjun is a civil rights lawyer, activist, professor, lawyer. He's an anti-hate activist. He published a book in 2018 called American Hate, Survivors Speak Out, which is testimonials of people who have survived hate from different groups, backgrounds in the United States before and after the 2016 election, presidential election. We have seen each other at youth camps. We have crossed our paths in White House events. I know Arjun is very outspoken. He's also somebody who has figured out a way of merging his vocation with his passion for anti-racism work, which is amazing. So Arjun, thanks for joining us from Washington, D.C. as well. So what I want to do now is, before I pose a few questions that I have for our panelists, I want to once again thank everybody who is joining us. Please let us know where you're joining us from. Post your city, region, state name. And if you have any questions at any point, please please do so in the chat. And I'll do my level best towards the end to come back to those questions. So to start, I'm going to pose a question to all three of you panelists, and I'll start with Gurpreet, and then Harleen will go to you, and then we'll go to Arjun. So I'm gonna start with George Floyd. You know, George Floyd was killed at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis a few weeks ago in Minnesota. And that kind of served as a trigger, a threshold for Black Lives Matter movement. It's now spread globally. And we are, amazingly, there are protests still happening. There are rallies still happening around the globe today. They're not getting reported, but they're happening. So what I want to know from all three of you is, how did you personally process what happened with George Floyd and subsequently what has happened? And how did you respond to sort of this movement that has sort of crossed this threshold?
So I will say for me personally, I'm trying to remember when I found out about George Floyd or where I found out. I'm pretty sure it was on Twitter. I saw him trending and I was like, oh no, not again. Then I went to CNN to watch and see like if this is actual like huge thing going on. And sure enough, people were in an uproar about it. And honestly, my initial reaction to it was just grief. I cried for so long. And eventually when I was tired of crying, I became really angry. What I wanted to do, I did want to join the protest, but since I'm at home with my parents this summer, and they don't want me getting involved in anything that can turn violent, I wasn't able to join. But I will say what changed for me internally is that I no longer could tolerate friends who were non-racist. Like, no, I couldn't do it anymore. But as for processing his death, I haven't processed it yet, especially since like there hasn't been justice yet. Because you know they'll charge these people, and then like when it comes to the actual trial, they find them not guilty. Then what do we do? So that's where I am right now.
All right, thank you for sharing that, Gurpreet. Harleen, how about you?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Gurpreet said resonates with me, partly because when I was reflecting on this question, I was taken back to, I think, the first murder of a Black person by police that had a profound impact on me, which was the killing of Trayvon Martin. For me, I think that happened, I want to say he was murdered my freshman year of college, and then the acquittal of George Zimmerman happened my sophomore year. And that actually also lined up with the Oak Creek shooting. And I actually, although my family's in Michigan now, I grew up in Wisconsin in the Oak Creek Sangha. And so for me, I think it was this really, alongside starting undergrad, taking cultural studies classes, sort of being conscientized in these different ways, it was a really interesting simultaneous process of all these examples of state violence really waking me up to, yeah, sort of the distrust of the narrative that I had been raised with. And so I think since then, every murder by police of a Black person or a trans person, or the people that the police continue to brutalize, I think for me has just been a continued reminder of the ways that the state continues to violate people. But I think what was unique for me this time that Gurpreet started to touch on is just the dynamics of the pandemic. And then I think also the nomination of Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee that I think sort of shifted sort of people's political consciousness. And I know we'll get into this later, but I think something just very briefly that was interesting for me this time was people speaking up who I'd never seen speak up before, especially amongst my peers, people who hadn't necessarily been vocal in terms of what we'd call racist behavior before, but they'd always been silent, they'd always been neutral. So I think that's something that's very intriguing to me of how do we keep that going? How do we keep that energy going?
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. What I think is unique in this, at least from what I'm seeing in my lifetime, the number of people who are engaged in our community and also broadly in America, that has surprised me in a good way. So that gives me a little bit of hope. How about you, Arjun?
So I was really angry. And then I found myself wondering why I was angry, because as somebody who works on these issues and studies them, we've seen things like this before. And then I caught myself realizing that we should never be sensitized to state violence. We should never be desensitized to police brutality. And so I sort of kind of let that anger manifest. And I think that that's actually a healthy and normal feeling to have in this moment when you watch that video and when you hear the story. And so my immediate reaction was to actually protest. And that's what I did. And so really, day after day, week after week, I just protested in DC, tried to support any way I could. In some cases, that was serving as a legal observer. In other cases, that was, just actually being there and another person with a sign, rallying with folks. And that's really what I've done since.
Yeah, so I have to say, Arjun, thank you for doing what you're doing. You're actually my eyes into what's happening in DC. I mean, I follow your Twitter feed, and I encourage everybody to follow Arjun on Twitter. But your feed actually has been my eyes into what's been happening in DC. But because you obviously see what's happening in the news covers what they need to cover. But then when you see, and I know a lot of people like you are doing this, they're covering marches, rallies, and you get to sort of see a little different perspective compared to what the news is reporting. So which is good. So I really appreciate what you have been doing, going out there, covering those protests, and obviously representing sometimes people as well who have been caught up in the melee and arrested. And we will get back into actually some of those things later on. So I wanna turn the lens sort of now broadly on the Sikh community. How have you seen, and I'm going to pose this again to all three of you, how have you seen Sikh institutions, so Gurdwaras included, or houses of worship, Sikh organizations, Sikhs at large, responding to Black Lives Matter movement? So Gurpreet, let's start with you.
So I'll focus on the organization aspect and the Gurdwaras aspect. As far as organizations, I've either seen silence, like complete utter silence, like nothing's going on, or, I've seen maybe panels, podcasts, and writing. But other than that, I haven't seen any sort of action plan or, this is what we need to do, et cetera, et cetera. And as far as the Gurdwaras, I will say here in Texas, and I even checked to confirm this with another person I know, it's been radio silence, like radio silence across the board. No mention of it on social media. No, like, oh, there's these protests going on, at least let's go serve something. Like, absolutely nothing, which is disappointing to me, but it is not surprising at all.
Okay, well, I can corroborate that, not entirely, but I feel that radio silence you're talking about, especially from our Gurdwaras, when it comes to really engaging with this movement, I can corroborate that is unfortunately true as well. Here in New York City as well. I mean, we've had langar sevas happening, but I think we need to be a lot more than langar sevas. So I'm with you. It's unfortunate, but I'm not surprised either. Harleen, how about you?
Yeah, I think about the same in terms of action. I agree. I think the only thing has really, which is still, good in the places it's happening. I think the biggest one I saw was in LA. Sangat going to downtown and creating booths and passing out langar and other resources for protesters there. But beyond that, I mean, I think what I've noticed is that our community is so far behind in terms of re-educating ourselves, in terms of real US history of racism, institutional racism, that I feel like now, like most communities, we're sort of caught in this really tricky place where the time for action has really come and gone several times. And we still don't know, say we as a collective, there are of course many Sikhs who do know, but we as a collective community don't know where our stance is. And so now it's sort of this tricky thing of like, let's hold panels, let's hold book clubs, and also this urgency of we need to do something right now. And I think that tension is creating a lot of problems in terms of what the community actually can and should be doing right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, yeah, that's the feeling. I've seen some conversations happening, panels, and certainly, here we are, we're having a webinar as well. But, my hope is that we have that critical lens on into some of these things that are happening. Arjun, how about you?
I would really just affirm Gurpreet and Harleen. I've certainly seen photos of Langar Seva, and that's been encouraging in New York, LA. I think there were a few places maybe in Texas as well. I do think where we have seen other types of action, often it's been because of the organizing and activism of young people and women in the community. So grateful to them for their service, and again, pushing our communities and pushing our elders to where we want them to be. But, for the most part, I don't think there's been enough. And I know we're going to spend some time talking about what advocacy organizations can do, what gurdwaras can do. Because again, when you look at Sikh history, this is a time where we should be very active. This is a time where we should be really engaged. And, I hope as part of this conversation, folks will have some ideas of things they can do to move the conversation forward.
Yeah, so that's actually a perfect segue to the next question that I have. And as you mentioned, Arjun, Sikh history, it's a young history, 550 years old, a rich history, very much grounded in equality for all, diversity, inclusion, equity to the core, recognize, everybody is created equal. We have different paths and journeys, and many are starting from our gurus, and many men and women with them, after them, have lived that principle. We've faced a lot of persecution. I have lived through some of that persecution in 1984. So I know there's a lot of conversations around social justice and justice in our community at different points. But for most part, and I want to say this honestly, we talk a lot about justice for our community, but I haven't seen a lot of sort of action-based calls for justice for other communities. So we might say, and maybe I'm guilty of this too, hey, Black Lives Matter, I'm doing a lot of art because I'm an artist, but how am I translating that into action, right? So that's where I feel our challenge is. And then if I were to, sort of put a context to this conversation, ninth Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, his martyrdom is to defend a community, not our community, but another community's right to practice faith, freedom to have to practice their faith. And it's an incredible example. There's many other examples. I'm picking that one just to sort of highlight that is the story, the narrative, the history we come from. And as you said, Arjun, and Harleen and Gurpreet as well, why are we not seeing engagement based on that? So let me pose this question to all three of you. Keeping that history in mind, that beautiful illustrates history, courageous history, compassionate kind of history, what do you think? How should our community be responding in a perfect scenario? Or perfect is a bad word. In a scenario that's reflective of our history and ethos, how should our community be responding to this movement right now? So Gurpreet, let's start with you.
Well, for me, when I was thinking of this question, I was thinking to myself, honestly, Sikhs cannot even respond yet because we're not at that state where we can respond yet. In my mind, I'm thinking to myself, within Sikhi, at least, well, the Sikh community has been reduced to just being spiritual, if you get what I'm saying. Like we go to Gurdwara, we do Simran, etc., etc. It's like those principles, those other political principles have been forgotten about. And even the Khalsa has been sort of reduced to, Khalsa Sikhs only do, Simran and stuff like that. The activism spirit has been lost. And I feel like we need to push that activist spirit within the Sikh community and then respond accordingly. Because if you ask Sikhs to respond now, they're not going to respond at all. But pushing it, saying, hey, this is our history, everybody's issues are our issues, because there's also that mentality that that's their issue, that's not our issue, which that's totally against Sikh history. So yeah, setting the foundation first before responding.
So what I'm hearing from you, Gurpreet, and I agree with it, there's a huge disconnect that Sikhs have to their own history, to their own history that is very political, has been political from day one, still is, but somehow there's a huge disconnect. So there's ignorance, there's lack of education of sort of political, social, cultural history. So that's a big issue. Okay, so that's a pretty key highlight. How about you, Harleen? How do you think our community should be responding given our ethos?
Yeah, I think going off of what Gurpreet said, I think that I agree, you know, if Sikhs were to sort of go out right now and say, okay, like we want to support, I think it would recreate a lot of the harms that we're already doing even in our silence. Like I think, very honestly, like I think about, I want to encourage folks to do Langar Seva, but I think about the anti-Blackness that will come out in our community's behavior, even as we're trying to do those things. So I think there's several prongs to it. I think one is that, you know, as a community, we both need to realize, yes, this political aspect that is inherent to our Sikhi Sarup, that is inherent to our legacy. I think we also need to realize the sort of structural assets that Guru Sahib left us with. So one for sure is Langar. I think the problem that many people have already critiqued in the discourse is that a lot of times when we're doing Langar, it's still for our own sort of PR. And so making sure that, again, when we're doing Langar, it is truly being done out of seva. Another thing I think is even literally just the Guru Ka, right? Like if you think about a Gurdwara, it is a safe, within the current political nation state, it is a sanctuary space, right? It is a safe, structured building in which people can gather, people can get food, people can congregate, they can have political meetings. So I think even just making Gurdwara safe, first of all, for everyone in our community, right? We have a ton of our own community baggage we need to deal with in terms of Gurdwara not being safe. But to me, a true Gurdwara would be a place that is a community hub for activists, for leaders, for people to come together to critically learn and plan for their actions. And I think, yeah, I think we have a lot of unlearning to do there in terms of reaching that reality. One big thing is that a lot of our Gurdwara employ cops to keep us safe, right? And so, and of course that comes from, again, you know, from the community I'm from, I understand that fear, but I think that goes back to Gurpreet's point of forgetting our own legacy, forgetting that Guru Sahib gave us a kirpan, gave us just to like protect ourselves. And so if we're relying on the state to do that, then that's sort of, we're really giving our traditions away. And then just, I know one last thing is, I think that, you know, when you mentioned Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib Ji Shahidi, I started thinking about that again. And the significance of that too, in terms of movement building to me, is that the Kashmiri Pandits came to Guru Sahib and said, we need help, right? Which again, I think we need to critically think why people aren't willing to come to us today to ask for help. Like, what have we done to lose that trust or not gain it in the first place? But the Kashmiri Pandits came to Guru Sahib, said, we need your help. We trust you to do the right thing. And so Guru Sahib Shahidi was led by the community who needed it, right? And so I think today, if we are truly to enter this movement from a place of humility instead of homma, instead of ego, it's listening to the Black community, listening to Black, queer, and trans folks, listening to Black women who are telling us, this is what we need, this is where we need you to go, and saying, Tikadi, right? Like, I will go there. That is the save I will do. I think that's what we need to do to start getting into this movement in the right way.
So it's interesting, you know, I heard learning from you, Gurpreet, that we need to learn our political history because we have a disconnect. And from you, Herlina, I'm hearing there's an unlearning we have to do of some of our biases that we have picked up along the way. And so kind of learning and unlearning go at the same time. And I know it kind of sounds a little counterintuitive, but Sikhi is all about self-reflection. How about looking at yourself and, okay, recognizing, you know, we have issues and that's what we're talking about here. How do we unlearn those issues? So Gurdwaras, I think, are integral to our community. And I think it sounds like, you know, that is sort of one arena, seems like, where we can take action. But again, learning and unlearning needs to happen. Arjun, how about you? How do you think our community should be responding and its institutions?
You know, one thing I wanted to lift up, Herlene, I was on your website recently, and I know you had done some work with Deepa Iyer's ecosystem map. And I found that that's a powerful tool that I use sometimes in my own work. And, you know, just pivoting to that, there's so much work that we can all do, whether it's in the context of disrupting, organizing, advocacy, healing. And so for me, it starts with, if someone wants to get involved, figure out what is your skill set, what's your role, and then let's figure out a way for you to be in service to this racial justice movement. I do think that it's critical that we have these difficult conversations within the Sikh community and the broader South Asian community about colorism, about misogyny, about caste discrimination and violence, about anti-Black racism, because those are real and those are topics that we've shied away from for a long time, as both, Gurpreet and Harleen said. I think it's important, again, to center Black voices, to follow their lead. And we just need to do a better job of that. And in some cases, I know a lot of gurdwaras are closed, because of COVID, but a lot of folks are still holding digital services. I see no reason that we can't invite local Black leaders to participate in digital services and talk about what Black Lives Matter is about, what's happening in our local communities or in their local communities, and how the local Sikh Sangat, can support them. I've always thought and hoped that gurdwaras can be community centers. And so within that spirit, I feel like so many gurdwaras have Punjabi classes for young people because we think Punjabi is an important part of our identity that they're not getting from school. The same is true for American history, right? And talking about learning and unlearning, I recently visited Montgomery, Alabama in December 2019, and those who are close to me know that I can't stop talking about it because as somebody who actually works on these issues, I learned so much from that one trip, visiting the lynching museum and memorial. And so I think as part of our, working with young people at gurdwaras, we need to educate them about the history of this country, about the genocide of Native Americans, about slavery, Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow. And then listen, let's just be honest, right? I mean, our community is very diverse. And some in our community also have a lot of money. And I think supporting community organizations is a wonderful idea. There's an organization called Believers Bailout that supports bond for folks who've been arrested, who are ensnared by the criminal justice system, or protesters, who were wrongfully arrested because they were exercising their right to free speech. I think would be extraordinary for gurdwaras to come together, pool some funds together and say, you know what, we are going to do Langar Seva, but we're going to do a different kind of Seva, right? We're going to make sure that people who have been arrested wrongfully are released. And then also just, we can get into this, but, also having, educating our communities about, and this dovetails with what Harleen was saying, educating our communities about what divestment means, about what abolition means, because, for better or for worse, our communities have historically been pretty reliant on law enforcement. It's not my position to tell, each community what they should do in every particular circumstance. These are conversations we have to have with one another. But it is a problem, unequivocally, that so many Sikhs don't know what divestment is. They don't know what abolition is. They don't know why that's been a call among so many Black leaders for a long time.
Yeah, so one of the things, Arjun, that I'm hearing there, and I take it personally as well. I mean, with the last presidential election, one of the things that I realized I had to do is I had to educate myself about American history. And when I say American history, I mean, the entire American history in terms of starting with slavery, starting with genocide, slavery, because a lot of us in schools and in universities do not get to learn those things, unless obviously, we choose certain courses and classes that we take. It should be mandatory for all of us, right? So what I'm hearing in your comments about this is there is a huge ignorance about American history, not only within Sikhs in America, but even a lot of Americans at large. So I think that is one of the things that needs to also happen. So I think, and you've kind of gone into some of the solutions that we should be engaging in. We're actually going to get into that, but I want to sort of quickly loop back into this question. I know you pointed out things that our community can be doing, but we know it's not happening. So I'm going to get a little pointed here. I want you to get into why do you think, starting Gurpreet, let's go with you. You said, you're seeing radio silence. You're not seeing gurdwaras doing a whole lot. I want you to get into why do you think that is not happening in Texas in some of those gurdwaras. Now, it might be happening as I know Arjun said, maybe, but I want you to get into what you think. Why is that not happening? What is the underlying reason you feel that activism is not there?
If I am to be completely honest, the reason why I think the activism is not there is because some people, they are here physically in the United States, they're here physically in Texas, but their minds are elsewhere, usually back home in India. And they're concerned about what's happening in India, which is very important. But they also need to realize that there's issues going on around them that you can't ignore and avoid, and that you should be fighting towards here as well as overseas. You can do both at the same time. I think there's also this narrative in the Sikh community. It's like either you fight for us or you fight for like other communities and forget about us. You know, you can do both at the same time. So that's the reason why I think there's the radio silence.
So I have to, one thing I think that you mentioned that really connects with me is there is this sense of others. You know, in Punjabi, we call apne. You know, we see a Punjabi and we go apne, and then we see others. And so our language, and I know this is not true just to Punjabi, it's true for many languages. The words we use to say us and them, we actually have that in the Sikh community as well. And it's a really unfortunate thing. I have to make myself aware a lot of times, hey, I should not be saying it's that community, because we live in America, we live in our local communities, our neighbors are community members for us. So that's what I'm hearing from you, and thank you for that reminder. Harleen, how about you? Why do you think some of the things that you mentioned we should be doing are not happening?
I think in addition to what Gurpreet said, I think another, and this ties into sort of not understanding the connections between Punjab or Indian or South Asian history and US history. I think that there's a lot of fear and a lot of trauma that is unresolved within our community, from both colonization, from state violence. And I think that we really have not been, this is a lot of what my dissertation focuses on, but we really have not been frank about how colonization really disrupted and sort of completely warped and transformed our own ideas of Sikhi and what Sikh identity should be. So even very briefly, what I'm working on in my dissertation right now is thinking about how the British took Sikh ideas of Meedi and Piri, took Sikh ideas of Shastra Vidya, and turned that into being part of the military, right? Guru Sahib never said be part of an institutional military. It was that each person should be armed for themselves and be able to use physical defense on behalf of the people. There was never anything about being part of a nation state military or imperialism. And so I think, and I'm sure even the way I explained it now is maybe inaccessible to people, which is something we need to start to deconstruct, like Arjun said, right? Start to sort of make these things accessible to our community. But I think because of these traumas, all of our Sikh organizations, all of our Gurdwara, all of our national Sikh organizations, even us as people, we've really become invested in the relative comfort and privilege that we can find. And within a US racial hierarchy, that's always going to be in relation to Black people and the perpetuation of anti-Blackness, right? So I think that in order to do that, we sort of, going to the next step, I think we really have to get back to a place of being rooted in a true Gurmat-based value system. And even just beginning with Mool Mantar, like we have to get to a place of Nirpal, we have to get to a place where we are living without fear. We are removing our ego and sort of reclaiming this, radical lineage to be able to experience and connect with Vaheguru through truth and love. Yeah, so I think I'm reminded of this shabad, Jalo aisi reet jit main pyara visre. Those rituals, those sort of practices that take me away from Vaheguru, that take me away from my beloved, I have to just burn those, like I think we just have to get to a place where we need to realize, even though it seems like it, we have nothing to gain in the long run from being part of the police, being part of the military, continuing these misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic behaviors. Like it seems like we might be winning now, but we're all going to go down with it in the end. So I think just having the removal of ego to get to that place.
Yeah, so thank you, Harleen, for sort of bringing that aspect of Sikhi in, because I struggle with it, right? I mean, I know when I read Gurbani, I sort of understand, at some level, intellectual level, the message. I know the Paikanayas who, saw sort of that light, and even in this so-called enemy at the moment, you're in the battlefield, and then you have many others. And I'm always wondering, how do you get to that state where you just don't see somebody as the other? It's a hard thing to do. I know it's a central message in our faith, but it's such a difficult thing to do. But then How do you make it part of your everyday life? How do you, and I know all three of you kind of touched upon it. It's like a meditation, right? You have to have these conversations on a daily basis, reminding yourself, what good did I do today? What bad things did I do today, right? And that's kind of like the sort of the connection that I hear in terms of what you're saying, sort of from Gurbani, which is sort of our spiritual source. Arjun, how about you? I mean, I know you touched already upon some of the items in terms of why we're not as a community able to do the right thing, but get into sort of, if you can sort of pinpoint a few things you feel are the source of that sort of lack of success we have in terms of being really engaged on these issues.
I don't have too much to add. I think Gurpreet and Harleen covered it. I think there's anti-Black racism. I think our community has their own troubles, right? I mean, I feel like for a long time we've disempowered girls and women within our community, to say nothing of homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia. And so I think a lot of it is just, it's that. I think that the trauma that Harleen points out is really important. And I think that's something that also manifests for folks. We're still trying to reconcile and process and understand our own history, 1984, and then the decade of enforced disappearances that followed it. Even looking at what's going on in India today, right? I mean, we just had an anti-Muslim pogrom in Delhi, right? We're seeing legislation like the NRC, the CAA, and hate violence surging across that country. I will say that I am hopeful, because as the protests went on, at least in DC, I felt like I saw more and more Sikhs showing up. In some cases, I saw Sikh families. My whole family came. It was my nephew Saib's very first protest, and I have this great photo of him holding a sign with a quotation from Dr. King saying, "A threat to justice." The exact quote, now I can't remember it. One of you probably know it, but an injustice is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I'm having conversations with him about it, and, it's been really wonderful. And so I think a lot of what we need to do is have those difficult conversations with elders, but also with our young people. And so where I have seen a lot of really wonderful movement has been amongst young people and women. And so I think within the Sikh community, we would just be wise to do everything we can to just, center them in some of these conversations.
Yeah, so thank you, Arjun. I mean, I know we're talking today about Sikhs and Black Lives Matter movement, but we know, as you pointed out, it's a man's world when it comes to broadly the Sikh community globally. And it's really ironic because our faith is totally based. It's one of the early sort of faiths that very explicitly talks about equality, all kinds of equality. And we are sort of, what we have done is we've sort of put Sikhi into a Punjabi wrapper, and Punjabi is not all bad. There's beautiful aspects to Punjabi culture, but I think Sikhi is a very universal sort of global principle kind of faith, but we kind of wrap it into the South Asian Desi mold. And unfortunately, that's to our detriment, because I think there's some beautiful stories and histories to be shared where people might actually ask us questions, and this conversation that we're happening, it should be happening with others. And I use that word again, I'm catching myself because I'm using that word others. What I'm saying is outside of the Sikh community, we should be having these conversations as well, critical conversations. So I wanna get to the next question, and I think we've kind of touched upon it. And I know we're focusing a lot, a lot of issues have come out, and it might seem like to some of the audience members as they hear, and there's a lot of issues. Well, that's humanity for you, right? We all have problems, we all have a lot of issues. And the way to get to solutions is you got to take stock of the issues we have. So how do we develop a better understanding of historical and institutional racism as it pertains to the US, and how Sikhs have been complicit? So Harleen, how about if I start with you on this question, and then we'll go to Gurpreet and Arjun.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think that, as we've already said, I think it's a lot of unlearning. I think that we all need to acknowledge that we were taught intentionally an incomplete and often inaccurate history. And I think, again, as Sikhs, we need to lean in to the places where we should be able to understand this, right? So if we think about Sikh history in relation to India, how it's been rewritten and reconstructed, I think this is something we should be able to understand is true. I think the other thing that has been really encouraging to see in like the mainstream conversation is the popularity of now anti-racism versus just I'm not racist or I don't support racism. I think we need to realize that, you know, within my own camp spaces with my counselors and campers, I explain to them that the same way we're taught about like photosynthesis, gravity, all these sort of very hard science systems in school, we need to be taught about racism, sexism, patriarchy. Like these systems need to be taught in the same way because they are just as true and impact our reality today just as much. Hopefully we can get to a place where that's not true. But because of that, if you think about racism as like a downward rushing stream or river, if you are not actively, constantly swimming against it, it is going to pull you back into it. So I think that's what we need to realize, that if we are not, as Guru Sahib told us, right, like whatever action you are taking on, you need to be conscious with it with every breath. And so I think we need to realize that if we're not doing that, it's not enough. And for me, I'll just share for me, like a lot of that happens through reading, happens through both fiction and nonfiction, just like listening to other narratives, hearing other perspectives, and widening my own experience through other people's experiences as well.
Yeah, so it's a great point, Harleen. I mean, my evolution has happened a lot through books as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one book that comes to mind. You mentioned anti-racism, and you know that word has become sort of part of the mainstream now, and it wasn't the case only a few months ago. At least I wasn't hearing it much. I know maybe Arjun, Gurpreet, you might have heard it more because you're active, sort of engaged. But I am hearing the word anti-racism as a goal now more than ever. And there's one scholar who comes to mind a lot, whose books have really had a huge impact on my understanding of race and racism. It's Ibram X. Kendi, who actually was based out of DC, and I think now he's moved to Boston. He's heading a new center for, I believe, race and racism in Boston. But his one of his books won the National Book Award in 2018, I believe, and it's called Stamped from the Beginning. And it's I would say, the best history of race and racism in America today. Well, for the past 500 plus years. It's a painful book to read. It's a really big book to read, but it really sort of gets into the foundations of how this nation is founded on race, racism, and genocide. So yeah, but thank you for sort of highlighting the fact that, you know, we all have learnings to do, education, reading. So thank you for bringing that on. Gurpreet, how are you? How do you feel about sort of how do we have a better understanding of institutional racism, historical racism in the US, and how, I know you've touched upon this, how we Sikhs are complicit as well?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off what Harleen said. As for learning about institutional racism, reading, there's plenty of material out there. You can do a simple Google search and stuff like that. It's just like, do you want to do it? So there's that. As for how Sikhs have been complicit, like learning how Sikhs have been complicit, for me, the first thing that popped into my mind was ask a Black Sikh. Like, we know the ins and outs of the Sikh community, and we can definitely tell you how Sikhs have been complicit. I can even, because I'm in contact with multiple, I can even get you in contact with whoever you want to get in contact with to learn about it. And if you ask them about that, they won't hold back. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, so I know, Gurpreet, you and I have had this conversation before. You know, you've faced a lot of anti-Black racism within the Punjabi community. Do you, how do you, I mean, and maybe, you know, I know I'm going to get to this question later on. Maybe I'll hold off to that. I'm going to come back because I think I'm going to sort of ask this question of all three panelists, but thanks for sharing that. Arjun, I know you've covered some of the strategies, but how do you, I know we've talked about knowing American history, reading, but is there something else you could add to that thought in terms of how do we confront sort of this institutional racism and how we Sikhs are complicit? And look, we can also be part of the solution.
You know, I don't have too much to add. The only thing I will say is that I think for a long time, there are many Sikhs who have felt comfortable playing into kind of the sort of model minority myth, right? This idea, well, if you just play by the rules, everything will work out for you. And look at us. And I think that really ignores American history, and it ignores structural racism. Just because there is a pocket of people within our community who were able to climb the economic ladder, it doesn't negate anti-Black racism. It doesn't negate structural violence and structural racism. And I do think that for some time, there are elements within the Sikh community who've really embraced that role. And it's been very divisive, not just for the broader Sikh community, but just for the racial justice movement as well.
Yep. So I'm actually here at the conclusive question. I mean, it's amazing how time flies. I want to quickly encourage everybody who is in the audience. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, please put them in the Facebook live chat. I'm hoping we can address some of these questions posed to our panelists. So the last question that I have, I know we've talked a lot about the need of the hour, the urgency of the hour, and some of the problems that we face as Americans, as Sikhs in America. You've touched upon a few strategies of how we can perhaps deal with some of those issues in terms of how do we make progress. But I want to push you a little bit in terms of getting specific about concrete solutions you can talk about that we Sikh community in the US can use today. So maybe alternatives to what is being done, or maybe in addition to what is working today, what are a couple of things we can do as individuals, as members of our respective Sikh communities, wherever we are in the US, globally, to sort of put some of these ideas that we have discussed into action? So Gurpreet, how about we start with you first?
Well, for me, I would say I would really love to see the Gurdwara like incorporated into Sikh activism, because there is Sikh activism going on, but it's like outside the Gurdwara. So for me, it would be putting the call out there like, hey, if you want to be an activist, come join us and stuff. You can be an activist too. I know it's hard to believe, but you can. And possibly organizing within the Gurdwaras and coming together and researching what are the local issues, getting an action plan together, and actually going through with it. Because there have been a few instances where people who, they'll say, okay, we want to do this, but they don't follow through with it. So that's one thing I think is important for being an activist. You actually have to follow through with what you say you're going to do. So there's that. And another thing, teaching the younger Sikhs, yeah, they're pretty open to it. At least I've found with the younger Sikhs, they're pretty open to learning about it and stuff. They find it interesting. So, and they're the future generation. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I get to work a lot with kids, and kids give me hope because we all learn our prejudices and biases. We're not born with them, so they give me a lot of hope. I do know the older generation has, they picked up obviously a lot of prejudices from be it Desi or American culture. So it's a work in progress, but the young ones do give me hope. And I agree with you. It's interesting, you mentioned that you feel that there's not enough activism in Gurdwaras. I think sometimes what happens is there's activism maybe in some Gurdwaras that is very, very Sikh focused, but there is not activism that is your community as in broadly, wherever you are, right? Be it Texas, be it New York, Southern California, DC, right? Are you really doing activism for your communities that are outside of the Sikh community? And I think for that, certainly we have a lot of work to be done. But thank you for sharing those. Harleen, how about you? What are, one or two sort of concrete solutions that we can implement today in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably just to repeat what I've already said, I think it's really a two-pronged approach of both building an anti-racist education practice on an individual, communal, and organizational level to really re-educate ourselves. And then with that, taking action, right? So again, for Sikhs, I think on a national level, really just divestment from the institutional belonging that we have and the comforts and attachment that privilege offers us. Gurpreet's comments about the possibilities of the Gurdwara, made me start reflecting on something I was thinking about this week, of this tension we have between not using the Gurdwara and sort of being frustrated with Sikh organizations. And for the first time, I think I finally realized that a lot of our faith or disappointment in Sikh organizations is because we have sort of given up on our Gurdwara. And I think that as a community, we need to realize that Sikh organizations that are functioning as nonprofits cannot do the same radical work that our Gurdwara can do, right? So sure, people, nonprofit experts can talk about this much better than I can, but if you're an organization that has to sort of function within the parameters of a society, that's not going to be able to push the envelope in any way. So I think as a community, we need to sort of look at Sikh organizations as nonprofits and as advocacy organizations that are working on issues that pertain to a good number of Sikhs, but not look at them as Sikhi organizations. Our Sikhi organization is our Gurdwara, right? And so I think that that reframing of where should our site of action and activism really be is important for us.
So there's a very interesting distinction that I'm hearing from you, Arlene. There are more than a few advocacy organizations, Sikh organizations in the US and Canada and the Western world, and broadly, globally as well. And they're serving the Sikh community, sometimes actually many different communities. But I guess the challenge, and I know all three of you kind of mentioned this, how do you, certainly serving challenges that Sikhs face in the US, they are very unique challenges, they are big challenges, but how do you also pivot sometimes to serve communities that are sometimes, I'll go on a limb on saying this, African Americans face bigger challenges than Sikhs face in America today. I know some people might disagree with me at this moment, but I have no qualms in saying that I don't get pulled over by cops. I have never felt like, I'm gonna get shot at by cops. Now, maybe there have been few instances, but that's not a usual Sikh experience. So how do we pivot as organizations that even our Gurdwaras to serve communities that are in much dire straits? And our history teaches us, hey, we're actually equipped. We can do things to start saying, hey, we can be more constructive in our efforts to fight injustices, be it African Americans, be it Indigenous communities. Arjun, I know a lot sort of has been said in terms of solutions. I know you have sort of spoken about some of those earlier. Is there something else you would add to this conversation in terms of like something concrete that institutions or organizations or even individuals can do that you have not heard yet?
I said a lot of what I wanted to say earlier, and again, it's been wonderful being part of this discussion. Thank you, Vishabji. Thank you, Gurpreet. Thank you, Harleen. Really want to affirm and echo what you've shared. Two quick thoughts. One is, one of the sort of founding mottos of Black Lives Matter is when Black folks are free, we will all be free. And I think that sort of ethos, that ideology is really important because the fact of the matter is that Black folks face structural racism. They face structural violence in ways that Sikhs, as a matter of fact, just do not. And so I think our community just needs to sort of learn that history and just become aware of that so that they understand that and kind of process it and sort of be an ally to the movement. The second point I'll make is that, and this is sort of a cause that I'm very, very committed to, especially right now. I wrote about it a couple of weeks ago, and that's dropping the charges, right? So there have been, at this point, I would guess more than 20,000 people who have been arrested for protest-related charges, whether it was violating curfew, whether it was disorderly conduct, looting, rioting. And there are serious consequences that folks face for these charges. And I think that these charges across the board should be dropped. And really, when we think about things like divestment, we think about things like abolition, the vast majority of criminal justice reform happens at the local level, right? And so what better function, what better way for Gurdwaras to be involved than to support local advocates, local community organizations who are trying to ensure that there is meaningful criminal justice reform at the local level, right? And so when we have national conversations, they seem abstract, but Gurdwaras can get connected to people locally and get some of this work done and be the allies that we need to be. And so that would be my call. Get the charges dropped, but let's also get these prisons empty, right? Let's build more schools. Let's stop building prisons in this country.
Yeah, no, and thank you for bringing that up, Arjun. I know there's many narratives that are being framed right now. I mean, the very fact that we call, the word protest, right? I mean, okay, they are protests, but why are we not calling them rallies for justice, right? So the choice of words matter, and right, and then subsequently, I know there are many Americans, including Sikhs, who have made this argument. Well, some of these protests have turned violent, right? People are destroying property. They are destroying small businesses, right? And therefore, we need heavy-handedness, right? We need to have curfews. We need to arrest these people. But I think it's sometimes easy to sort of go down that line and not realizing when you have denied justice to a community for 400 years, 450 years, it's very easy to say, hey, you play with our rules, and we will give you the space to go out and do what you need to do. And we'll frame that narrative, right? So thank you for pointing that out, because I think if any community should understand, it's our community. We have faced a lot of persecution in India and beyond, that we should know how the state frames you a lot of times. Right. And so I think we are in many ways in a position where we can actually understand that if we sort of educated ourselves about African American history and really American history, we would realize, actually, you know what, our gurdwaras, our communities are actually, we have the skills and the story and the narrative to be allies, like you have been. So it's a critical point. It's an incredible point. Thank you very much. So I'm actually looking at my screen here. There's a few comments that have come in, questions, and I want to see. I know we're actually almost out of time. Do you mind if I take 5 or 10 minutes of your time? We're good?
Sure.
That's fine.
So I want to quickly read through some of these comments here. So, and maybe there are questions here, and I want to maybe one or two we can take. People, they're talking about gurdwaras. And so some of the points you raised, I think it's important to consider that Sikhs from Punjab have faced their own colonization, oppression, ongoing intergenerational trauma, genocide, culturally, spiritually, physically. I think this is a factor that has resulted in Punjabi Sikhs becoming disconnected from their own roots and perhaps out of touch with Sikhi. I think you have touched upon it. Somebody else mentioned, I agree, Arjun, Gurdwaras could expand the availability of education to all aspects of the community they are in. Immersion in the community and vice versa. Absolutely, all of you have kind of touched upon that. So, Gurpreet, I know you mentioned this, and somebody put this point out here. Maybe we just need to invite Black people into our gurdwaras. And I think it's long overdue. And the very fact that we have not done it, it's shame on us. And I can't even begin to say sorry, because it's just inexcusable. So many seem uncomfortable, probably because of lack of education or fear, or just culturally racist. It's a combination of all of them. And I think it's about time. If there's one thing that is going to come out of this webinar, one message I can share with everybody, please invite Black people into your gurdwaras, into your camps, into your retreats, into your events. Any social justice, any Vaisakhi events, we should be bringing Black people who are members of our communities into these events. A few other, so we're not actually getting questions here. We're actually, I think people are, I mean, which is interesting, because I thought maybe we're going to see some defensive postures. I think at least people in the audience are agreeing what our issues are that you've highlighted very eloquently. I think what I feel the challenge is, Gurpreet, Harleen, Arjun, we've had this conversation. How do we keep these conversations going in our homes, in our communities, and in gurdwaras? That's the challenge we have. How do we, I know all three of you are very active, and you're going to take it back into your communities. The challenge that I'm facing is, how do these seeds sort of percolate different communities across the US, Canada, Europe, India? So yes, we've talked about education, reading, but how do we nudge people? So maybe reminders is, so the final thing I want to ask you, and I know I mentioned that to you, if there's one final kernel of wisdom, a quote you want to leave everybody with, this is the moment. I think we don't have any question. I think everybody kind of is like, okay, we hear you, we agree with you. I think you've given them some solutions. So I want to conclude by first saying thank you very much for taking time on a July 4th weekend to talk with me about these very important matters, about being very honest about our vulnerabilities as a community and how we can be part of the solution. So at this moment, if you can leave us with one or two statements of what we can do, or a wisdom that is something that we'll take away from this conversation. Gurpreet, do you wanna go first?
Yeah, I will read what I wrote. I said, as Sikhs, we are called not to watch history, but to be a part of it. Don't limit your efforts to social media, bring it to the streets.
Thank you. That's powerful. Harleen, how are you?
I think that as Sikhs, the biggest asset and benefit that I think I've tried to highlight several times is that we have Guru Sahib as our guide to really understand our placement in these struggles. If we turn to Gurbani, we see a constant discussion of how wealth will not help us, power will not help us, greed will bury us, our worldly attachments will just take us further away from the truth. And so I think that we need to detach ourselves from any sort of investment that we continue to have in our self-preservation, and really commit to this path of liberation. I'm reminded of the 14th body of Anand Sahib, Bhagdaki Chalnarali. Guru Sahib tells us this is not an easy path to walk on. Kanyo Tiki Valo Niki, right? It's finer than the edge of a sword and then a hair, like a piece of hair, right? So I think that those moments of discouragement, we need to remind ourselves that we're not alone. We're part of a legacy of Sikhs and also, liberation activists from various communities. And we really need to root ourselves in that legacy and remind ourselves that it's not easy, but if we commit to it, we're also not alone.
Thank you for that reminder, Harleen. I can attest to your statement. It's not an easy path. It's a beautiful path, but I have challenges every day. So it's a good reminder. Thank you for sharing that. Arjun, how about you?
The Montgomery Bus Boycott was 381 days. And so this is a long struggle, and I encourage folks, this is a difficult time. A lot of us are struggling with the epidemic. We want to make sure that our communities are safe, that we're safe. As you started the conversation, right? Racism and hate is an epidemic too. So we need to take care of each other. We need to take care of our communities. But we also need to be in this for the long run. And so when I think about, again, what preceded us, and I think about people walking 5 miles a day in the rain, in the lightning, because they would rather do that than suffer the indignity of being a second-class citizen, on a segregated bus. I just think we've got to do more and we've got to be better. And so I just encourage folks, find your role, find your place, and just contribute and be part of this generational moment.
Yeah, that's what came to just mind right now for me, Arjun, when you spoke of that is, I can place that civil rights movement that has happened actually in our Ardas, because, in Ardas, we talk about those who walk this path. And, of course, we remember many in our Ardas, our supplication every day. And we talk about those who gave their lives for justice and for equality, for themselves and for others. And I think we need to incorporate, one thing I'm hearing from all of you today in this conversation is we need to incorporate, we talk about Sarvata Pala at the end, which is, the wellness of the entire humankind. Actually, not even humankind, it's actually all living beings. I think to me, I have had the honor and privilege today of hosting you here. Thank you very much. You are sort of these 3 activists that I know, who I know are pushing the boundaries, going out on a limb, reminders to us as our communities, hey, it's a long journey. It's not an easy path, but it's been done before. We can get through this. We can be part of the solution, but the key is self-reflect, educate yourself. American history, Sikh history, find the connections. Those are my takeaways, and you've energized me. I'm gonna stay motivated on this path. Thank you. And my hope is I'll maybe bring you back in this conversation in a few months and kind of do a stock of things that have changed, things hopefully we've accomplished, and hopefully we will have a new political atmosphere, if I may say so, very politely, next year. But last thing I want to say to people, if you're American citizens, 18 or over, we have an election in November. Make sure you vote in your local election, in your state election, in federal elections. That is how change does also happen politically in America. So please make sure you vote, stay engaged, and please invite Black people into your communities. That's the final message I want to give. Thank you, Harleen. Thank you, Gurpreet. Thank you, Arjun, for your time and your wisdom. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Take care. Stay safe, well, and engaged.